All right, this tutorial is going to go over the writing of of your research paper, and this is a research paper I wrote for grad school. So I just want to first put out there that I do not expect your paper to be this long, and I of course do not expect your paper to have this many citations, and I don't expect your paper to be at this level yet. I know that you guys are just undergraduates, so I don't expect it to be at this level, but I do want to show you kind of what a good paper looks like. And that's the purpose of this, is to show you kind of what you might be striving for. So as far as the title page goes, you'll have what's called a running head, and this just goes in the header. And you'll put the title of your paper. If the title of your paper is really long, then you don't have to put the full title. You can just put an abbreviated title here. And of course, you're going to want to put running head in the top. So I'll scroll down. So this paper doesn't have a table of contents, but in your paper you will need a table of contents. So I'll go ahead and read the abstract. So the current paper summarizes the research on depression and coronary heart disease. The research confirmed that depression is a risk factor for coronary heart disease. So depression is a risk to get heart disease. And an individual's response for stress is an important factor in explaining the relationship between heart disease and depression. A heart disease event drastically increases risk of a depressive episode, and research also suggests that most patients who experience depression following a heart disease event have persistent depression for the next month. So that means that they're more likely to get, if they have depression following an event, that it's likely to last a long time. Patients with depression, with heart disease and depression, have poor health habits and are less likely to adhere to their treatment than non-depressed patients with coronary heart disease. And as a result, depression is associated with an increased death, a lower lifespan among patients with heart disease. So this is basically a good abstract. It summarizes the article briefly in a paragraph, and basically tells you exactly what the article is going to be about and what you can expect to get away from the article. So I do expect you guys to do an abstract, and as you can see, the format. So I'm going to go ahead and go down to the introduction. So I typed in the title at the top, so it says Depression and Coronary Heart Disease. And so this is the introduction. And so in the introduction, you're going to basically explain why, the topic is important. And so I go in and I say, coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, accounting for approximately 1 in 4 deaths each year. So that explains why it's important. It's the leading cause of death in the United States. That's why this topic is important. It develops from bad cholesterol accumulating in the bloodstream, leaving fatty deposits on arteries that restrict blood flow. And so with the citation, you can see here, I have the American Heart Association. And so I'll go ahead and show you guys how you can do that. So if you've looked at how to cite sources, which is on the tutorials from your article summaries, you have I have my list of articles here, and I can actually cite this article by going here and going to insert citation, and then I'll find the right the right citation that I want to cite and click on it, and then it will cite that article. One important thing to remember with in-text citations is if you have more than one, so if you cite 2 or 3 different, articles, you want to make sure that the citations are in alphabetical order. So it would go like, if I had the American Heart Association, the next one would have, if I did American Heart Association, then if it started with a B through Z, it would go after this one. So anyway, so that's just a little bit on that. As far as another thing to remember is you want to connect sentences together. So I don't want to read one sentence and go where, and then read the second sentence and be like, where the heck did that sentence come from? Why, how did you get that sentence from the sentence that you said before? So you see how these two sentences flow well together. Coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, accounting for approximately 1 in 4 deaths each year. coronary heart disease. So I'm saying it again. Why I'm addressing the same topic. Develops from bad cholesterol that accumulates in the bloodstream and restricts arteries or restricts blood flow in arteries. And then I go in to talk about the different symptoms of or the different types of heart disease. So a myocardial infarction or a heart attack is if the artery walls are clogged enough that the patient can no longer pump oxygen to the blood. And symptoms of a myocardial infarction include abnormal heartbeat, pain, discomfort, da 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 da. In case of a myocardial infarction, cardiologists prescribe blood thinners that reduce the thickness of the blood so it can pump through the narrow arteries. Treatments also include stenting and coronary da 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 da. So I talk about all the treatments here. I'm basically telling the reader, okay, this is what heart disease is. And heart disease is important, and this is what it is, because you need to know what it is to be able to understand the study. And so after I explain heart disease, then I go into depression, and I talk a little bit about depression and why it's important to consider in the context of heart disease. So recent research has suggested that clinical depression is associated with a 1.5 to 2 times increased risk of a coronary heart disease related event throughout the lifespan. Clinical depression is a mental illness associated with feelings of fatigue, da 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 da. So one of the things I want to point out here is I just talked about heart disease, and so now I want to talk about depression because that's the other variable I'm looking at. And so what I did was I did what's called a kind of a bridge sentence or a transition sentence. So I introduced depression while also addressing coronary heart disease. So I wrote a sentence here at this paragraph after talking to heart disease that talks about heart disease and depression. So I said, recent research has suggested that clinical depression is associated with a 1.5 to 2 times increased risk of heart disease related event throughout the lifespan. So now I've talked about heart disease to connect it to this sentence, but then I've also talked about depression. So now I can start talking more about depression down here. So it was a nice way to transition into talking about the next topic. Clinical depression is a mental illness associated with feelings of hopelessness, fatigue, disinterest in life, guilt, diminished concentration, and increased risk of suicidal ideation. The identification of depression as a risk factor for coronary heart disease has sparked interest, da 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 da. Given the severity of coronary heart disease, it's not surprising that patients are 15 to 20 times more likely than the general population to experience a depressive episode. After medical treatment, many of the patients who experience a depressive episode following a coronary heart disease event do not receive treatment for depression. So see how these all connect. I talk about, it sparked interest in the research community, given its severity of heart disease. Patients are 15 to 20% times more likely than the population to experience a depressive episode. And then I talk about here, patients experience a depressive episode, don't receive treatment, which is a problem. And then I talk about why it's a problem and what they can do to kind of get out of depression. And so, and that people, die, have shortened life spans because of depression, people that have coronary heart disease. And so so basically what I've done here is I've talked about, all the variables in the study. So all the variables that you're talking about in your paper. So my 2 variables are heart disease and depression. And so I talked about both those, and I explained why they're both important and why them connected together is important. And so I think from reading this introduction, you kind of get that. And then I go in here talking about, okay, the purpose of the paper, and that should be the last paragraph of your intro. So I go, the current report summarizes the literature on the connection between heart disease and depression. First, the paper will discuss depression as a risk factor for heart disease. Second, the paper will outline the role of stress response in explaining the relationship between depression and heart disease. And third, the research on comorbid depression and anxiety disorders is a risk factor. And then fourth, da 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 da. So So I basically listed out the different sections of the intro. What I recommend is I recommend, instead of starting with the introduction, I think you should write the body of your paper first. And I say that because and that's how I do it. If you want to write the intro first, that's fine. But I didn't know all this stuff until after I wrote the body of the paper. And so that's why I think writing the body of the paper is important, um, because you can, then what you're going to talk about, and you can obviously list that in this section, in this last paragraph here. But that concludes the tutorial on the introduction, and I'll go ahead and post. I'll go ahead and do the tutorial on the rest of the paper.